It's time once again for the school art auction project. So this year's theme is space. So my thought this year was to cut a lunar surface out of a piece of walnut that I cut up with my friend Gabe and have the kids make some kind of lunar base or rocket or probe or robot that would go on their little patch of the moon. And we'd make a lunar city out of that.
When our program continues,
we're hearing stories of people making the wrong choice.
So this is the walnut I cut up almost 3 years ago. It's now dry enough to be used for projects. I have a little bit of a cold, so I hope my voice is okay. So I found one of the slabs that looked like it would work. What I wanted was about a 30-inch square of material, and the slab isn't that wide. So what I'm going to need to do is cut 2 pieces out of this and glue them together to get the width that I want. So I had to figure out where those 2 pieces were within the slab and start to cut them out. And these first cuts I did with the circular saw. Then I can start to cut those pieces down on the bandsaw. Cutting a piece like this on the table saw is doable, but it's not as safe as the wood doesn't sit flat on the table. These had cupped a little bit, and one of the things I wanted to do was to cut them roughly in half and take out some of that cup. Sort of cut the piece lengthwise, then rejoint that seam and re-glue the pieces back together again and flatten the slab out. It turned out in the end I really didn't need to do this, as I didn't really need the thickness that I thought I did. So I could have just glued the 2 pieces together to get my width. So we jointed those edges, and I can glue my 2 sections back together again and get the slabs a little bit flatter. Then once the 2 sections of slab were glued together, I could glue those 2 together to get a roughly 30-inch square piece. And I let that dry. Now I went into Aspire, and it has a nice ability to take a height map, so a grayscale image where lighter sections of the image will be higher and darker sections will be lower. So I found a big grayscale height map of the moon, and I cut out a section that looked interesting. And I could use that in Aspire to make a lunar surface. You can adjust the height and you can adjust the smoothness. Once I had that all set up, I could run the cam part of the program and get my different passes. So I did a roughing pass and then 2 finishing passes. So a roughing pass with a big 2-inch bit, then a finishing pass with a 1/2-inch bit, and a finishing pass with a 1/4-inch bullnose bit. So it's sort of 2 roughing passes and then a finishing pass. This is the final finishing pass and gives the final surface. And Aspire has a pretty nice preview mode, so you can see whether it's really going to work or not. Now my glue up is all set. Mounting it to the table, I used some shims under one corner so it would sit flat. Then I used my hold downs sort of as stop blocks, and I put, I think, 3 screws into the piece to hold it to the table. I sank the screws under the surface quite a bit so that I wouldn't hit them with the bit. Then I flattened this face. So this face will be the bottom, or the back, I guess. But this will give me a nice flat surface to sit against the CNC table and to mount to the final frame of the piece. Now I can flip this over. I had made my computer file 31 inches square to give me a little extra material to work with. And my slab was just slightly bigger than that, but not much bigger. So I thought for quite a while about how to hold this down so I wouldn't hit the screws. I ended up using pocket screws along the edge of the slab just to keep them out of the way of the CNC bit. So this is doing the roughing pass, which worked fine until the bit jammed. It was just trying to take off too much. So I changed to a 1.5 inch bit, and that worked better. I also took off half the height per pass, so it wasn't taking off a whole lot. What really probably would have been the right size would have been a 1 inch bit, but I didn't have that, so this is what I had to make do with. It would have worked with a 1/2 inch bit as well. I just felt like that would have taken quite a while. So this removed the bulk of the material. Then I wanted to remove some of the sides as I had some extra material there. And instead of doing a drawing and laying out a path for the machine, I just drove the CNC machine around by hand and just cut those parts down. Then I did the first finishing pass with the 1/2 inch bit, and this just went along and removed more of the material. And this went pretty fast, and it made a lot of chips. And the surface was left fairly fuzzy, but that didn't really matter so much at this point. Then I changed to a 1/4 inch ball nose bit, and I did the final finishing pass. I'm squirting off the sawdust with compressed air, which is why it kind of blinks every once in a while. This took quite a while. I think it was about 2 hours. I don't really remember, but it was a while, going back and forth and back and forth. Then I set it up to cut the piece out. So I just had it cut a square. I'm watching it as it goes, make sure it's going to miss my pocket screws and cut where I want it to cut. You can see how close I'm getting to the screw here. Really, really don't want to hit the metal screw with the router bit. And I can clean that up, take the screws out, and we're about done on the CNC. And I can take it over to the work table. The surface was a little bit fuzzy, so I went over it with some sandpaper just by hand. That worked pretty well. I kind of liked the machining marks on the surface of the wood, so I didn't try and take those out. I had one little knot I wanted to pull the center out of, as it was loose. Then I can clean up the edge where I had bridges holding the inside and the outside of the piece when I cut it free. I can clean those up with a flush trimming router bit. I'm going to cut this into a grid of smaller squares. So I laid out that grid and I labeled the back of all of the pieces so I would know which square went where. I think I did letters vertically and numbers horizontally. So I can now cut it into 36 5-inch squares. I set it up so my center seam would be right in the center, so I could get rid of that seam with this first cut. Then I could cut it into 5-inch strips. And those strips could then get cut into 5-inch squares. And I set my little stop block to the same length as the width, so I'd get a square. And I have everything cut up. This is one of those little operations where the actual cutting is easy. It's the making sure I'm not going to screw it up beforehand part that takes a while. Now to go off to school to have the kids work on their part. I cut up a few more little pieces to add to my bin of little pieces. And we had the kids build little lunar bases. We got a lot of rockets and a few rovers and a few tanks, some nice space house kind of things. and I think they did great. And we carefully brought everything home, and Claire really wanted to lay everything out, so she did that. We moved a couple around, we split a couple up. I shortened some of the heights on a few of them because they were just too tall. What I want to do here is make a backing piece for all of the squares to sit on. So I cut out a piece of plywood and I stained a grid on that plywood. I wanted to put a piece of trim around the edge of the plywood, so I cut out some walnut for that. Basically, I'm just edge banding here. I made a little miter for the corner, and then I just glued the strips to the edge, and then some pin nails. Now I can lay out all the pieces. So we thought it looked best with a little gap between each of the pieces, which is why I painted the grid on the backing piece, so that that grid would be dark. I didn't want to be gluing to the stain, so I only put stain where the grid was. Then I could just glue all the pieces in place. I didn't try and clamp any of these. I just put glue on the back and put the piece down and held it in place for a few seconds, and it seems to be fine. And I got some spray lacquer. I've never tried spray lacquer in the past, so this is my first use of it, and it seemed to work pretty well. This wasn't the kind of project that I wanted to paint by hand. So this is what it ended up looking like. We have sort of a hodgepodge lunar city, but I think the kids had a lot of fun. Thanks for watching.